I have a favorite saying is that socialists are the kids who like group projects in school.
Right.
That's exactly what it is, right? It's a bunch of people. One person does all of the work, and a bunch of people free ride off the other person's work. And everyone's like, "Oh, this is great," except for the person who does all the work, going, "Why are you getting the A for this?" So, yes, is this whole idea of collectivism and just free riding off of other people's work and efforts really is ingrained in so many things of the schooling system.
I started reading your book and I was immediately captivated. I think I mentioned in an email that I'm a really big stickler for first paragraphs, introductions, especially in legal writing and legal briefs and Supreme Court briefs, even. I just think it's really important. And I was just was sucked in from that first paragraph, and I plowed through the book. I loved it. I have so many questions for you. The first of which is, you've been on sort of Main Street and Wall Street. You've been an investor, small business advocate, critic of central planning. And I'm wondering, what's the thread that connects all of these different positions that you've held, and what drew you to that?
I think I've always been an individualist. I think that I was born as somebody who appreciated freedom and individualism and have been a bit contrarian. It's actually saved me literally in times in my life. I actually you would have ended up dead if I had not been somebody who had been, um, you know, someone who was willing to do my own thing. And this was just always sort of my own belief system. And then when I started exploring the actual belief systems, I realized, oh, okay, there are many people who've been talking about this. This is what the country was founded on. I align with these kinds of things because I think that it's really what makes America unique in the world. There was no other country that was founded on individual rights and the protection of those, and that has made us the most prosperous country in the world. It's had people all around the globe fighting to come here, by any means. And so to move away from that, which is something that we've seen happen certainly over decades and at an accelerating pace, I think is a real tragedy. And as somebody who's been able to embrace that American dream because of that foundation, I do think that I have a responsibility to fight to uphold it for other people.
Yeah, and touching on that sort of individualist ideology, I love so much in the book that you pull no punches for freedom. Sometimes we think about, oh, we're just trying to, soften the ground, and how do we? In some circles, I think there's almost like an aversion to phrases like freedom or liberty, and so we're trying to find, you know, we're trying to do some sort of subtle sort of persuasion, and you just pull no punches. You use these wonderful phrases, just putting it very straightforward and bluntly, and as if you're just taking it for granted. You're not trying to persuade anybody. You're like, this is just true that government exists to protect your rights. That's really all it should be in the business of doing. And historically, people who have owned nothing, people who haven't had property rights, have not been happy. I was just struck by these beautiful, straightforward phrases that really spoke to me. And it doesn't come off as political, and it comes off as ideological, but hard to pin down exactly, maybe what that philosophy is. And I'm just wondering, you said you were sort of born an individualist. Took me longer to get there, but I'm wondering, what were your philosophical influences, once you did discover the political theory behind it? Who do you think has been, maybe a mentor to you, or a big influence?
So I'm one of those people. I don't really have heroes and I don't have people that I look up to. And maybe that's what's sort of at the foundation of being an individualist. I like to take pieces of information. I separate art from artist. I don't worship any individual. It's just, as you read different people, whether it's Thomas Sowell or Hayek or Ayn Rand or, sort of anyone, there's a lot to take away. It doesn't mean that I may, agree with every single thing they say. And there may be people who I don't agree with a lot of what they say, but there's also nuggets I can garner from them. So I found myself actually kind of forming my own opinions, and then people be like, oh yeah, that was so and so, and I'm like, oh, it was. And then I would go back and sort of backpedal it, because I've never really been, as you identified, a political animal. I got dragged into political commentary, but I really have no foundational interest in politics. I think it's horrible. I have no desire to be in politics. I was just kind of putting forth my opinions in the way that I synthesized information in the world from lived experience and reading and whatever else, and would constantly hear, oh, those are aligned with these people, and then go back and go, oh yeah, okay, it was. But it's not as if I grew up with any sort of political sort of bent or ideological bent. And I think the individualism just came from the way that my parents raised me. And then I realized, oh, there are all of these thinkers that are saying the same kinds of things that I came to on my own, and that has allowed me to have a richer understanding of those philosophies and ideals and data points and all that great stuff, to go, okay, yeah, you're not crazy.
Yeah, I love that. And it really speaks to me because I think that's really healthy. And it's something that's sort of missing in our society, is that you can take things from different people, regardless of, you don't have to agree with everything. It's something Sean Ono Lennon, who's also something of an individualist, he said on social media, just because I retweet one thing that somebody said, or quote one thing that somebody said, does not mean that I endorse everything they've ever said. It's okay to like one thing. I have a picture here, Frida Kahlo, because I can separate the art from the artist.
Right. Which, by the way, makes people much happier. I find that that's actually a key to happiness, that if you can separate your feelings about, one aspect into everything a person does, it really makes you much happier. And frankly, I love that Sean Ono Lennon said that on social media, because social media is a place where there is no nuance. Mm-hmm. And most discussion points, that there are some frameworks that are not nuanced, but a lot of things, there is nuance, and not everybody has the same thoughts. I mean, if we had to align with everyone that had the exact same thoughts, we wouldn't have spouses or family members or friends. And that's, part of the human experience, is saying, okay, I can agree with you on these points, and here's where we differ, and we can still live side by side.
Yeah, definitely. Social media is, almost it's that idea on steroids, but I feel like people should bring that into their everyday life too, that it's okay to have friends with different, ideas than you. And as long as you accept that they're good people and want good things. And that's something actually I think advocates of the free market and individualism kind of have to fight against. Is I do think that people with other philosophies, it's just taken as true that they want good things. We know that they have the best of intentions, even if we think that their means are terrible. Whereas, libertarians, conservatives, advocates of the free market, to take it out of political terms, we have an uphill battle, because we have to sort of, our motives are taken as not good, and we have to fight to show people that we want good things for everyone too. We want a better world. We believe that the free market is the way to get there.
And I also think that a lot of people who couch the idea that they're trying to help other people often are very self-serving. I'm sure you ran across it in the book, my Twilight Zone reference to the episode called To Serve Man, where, there was this very noble, set of intentions that we're here to do good for man. We're here to serve man, but To Serve Man was a cookbook. And so I find that a lot of times the people who are talking about, oh, well, we're doing this, for somebody else's benefit, really is code for I'm doing it for my benefit, and I'm putting a pretty wrap around it so people don't understand that. So I think that's an interesting battle that is often fought. The people who are saying, hey, I'm an individualist, but that's going to bring about good outcomes. How dare you? And the people are like, no, I'm going to plan the good outcomes, are somehow thought of as heroes, when it's clear that, you're planning is just for your own power and benefit and your cronies and friends, and you kind of don't really care about what happens to everybody else. So it is a little bit of bizarro world, but that's where we're living.
Yeah. You spoke about sort of being born an individualist, but I wonder if there was a moment or experience that really solidified your view of government's role in the economy, or if it's, I mean, it's been a tough time out here for many decades, so maybe not. But if there's something that sticks in your mind.
I don't really, and this, I would say this about everything in my life. There are very few things where I'm like, here's a concrete turning point. It's more of looking at things and there's a snowball effect. And the more that you look at them, the bigger the snowball comes until you're like, oh my God, we're in an avalanche here. And I feel like that had been the case, is that the more I started talking about principles and being forced to do that by being in the media, talking about these things and learning, everything was sort of backwards to what just makes sense to me from a common sense, foundational perspective, as well as, general laws. I think I talked about this in my second book, The War on Small Business, the whole idea of economies or diseconomies of scale. Coming from the business world, as things scale, you're actually supposed to drive more benefits from that scale. And the exact opposite situation happens with government, where you have a diseconomy of scale, that the bigger that the government gets, you actually end up with worse outcomes and get less for the largesse. So I think that, just looking at those kinds of things and piecing them all together as sort of a jigsaw puzzle, you kind of get to, wow, this is really messed up. And exactly the opposite of the things that not only I believe, but I believe will lead to better outcomes, and that in many cases have provably led to better outcomes. And that's the weird thing, is that when you have some really clear data points of where things have clearly worked and clearly not worked, and then somebody's like, oh, well, we haven't tried it this way, or it's different this time, or there's a different letter next to it, so now I'm for it. That's just mind-boggling to me, and it's something that I'm struggling with actually in our current policy situation, is that people who've made very clear, cogent arguments during COVID are now making the exact opposite arguments during the tariff situation. And I just, I always say, look at it blind. Just look at the policy and put someone else's name next to it. And if that person did it, would you be happy with it? And I don't think a lot of people are first willing to do that exercise, or being honest about the outcome. And that's why I love anytime there's a man on the street interview where they change the names and say, oh, so and so said this, and then you get an agreement or a disagreement just based on that. And it's a very dangerous way to live.
Yeah, partisanship is one hell of a drug. I appreciate that answer, because maybe now I'm going to fight against my own question, which is, I think people seek and they're curious about, and they want people to talk about that one big moment in your life that things change. But, actually I recall trying to make a career decision pretty early on, right after I graduated law school. And I was speaking to someone that I worked with at the time. And she said, there's going to be a lot of points in your life where this decision feels like the biggest thing. But trust me, there's always the next biggest thing. Life is a series of big decisions, and nothing is, the one be all end all. I in your book, I was also struck by you not only call out big and bloated and arbitrary and protectionist and anti-competitive government, but also the threat of big business. And I think I'm, sensitive to that, because I am such a proponent of the free market, and also because nowadays there seems to be some questions about, given the growth of big business and the real threat to our everyday freedom, what's then the solution? And there's people who are suggesting that we need more regulation to fix that. And, of course, I'm very skeptical of regulation. But it seems to me that you do maintain this very firm line about constitutional protections only pertain to the government. We don't necessarily apply those to big businesses just because they're big. And I wonder if you would agree that, the biggest solution to many of the problems that you outline in your book is getting government out of the way, scaling back government. Because if we scale back the size of government, we necessarily scale back the threat of these big businesses who have harnessed government power at our expense.
It's exactly it. This is a fight that I have ideologically with some of my friends who are progressive and on the left, who can't seem to understand that the issue, the crux of the issue is the big government, that the reason these big businesses seem anti-competitive sometimes, or are being favored, is because they are. And if the government didn't have the ability to tilt the playing field, to put their thumb on the scale, then we wouldn't have that same sort of issue. And so, it's a different approach to, I think, a similarly identified problem, is that a lot of what we have today has moved away from a true capitalism, which, I call it, free marketism, or, freedom and choice, basically making the decisions, to something that is, a cronyism. I never use crony capitalism because there is no cronies in capitalism, so I'll just call it cronyism. But that's what it is, and you're exactly right. I think that sometimes people don't think, like chess players think three moves ahead, or don't think about butterfly effects. But when you think about regulation, it always sounds good, but the reality is that, with regulatory capture, a lot of times these big businesses are using regulations in a way that is meant to be anti-competitive and to actually hurt smaller businesses. One of the best examples comes out of the Great Recession financial crisis, where we had, these big institutions who took very risky bets. And the solution was that we were going to create this regulation, not just for them, but for everyone in Dodd-Frank. And what that ended up doing was, because it was so onerous and so difficult for small players to comply with, that it ended up putting smaller players out of business. It slowed, and in some places, like, ground to a complete halt, the formation of small and community banks. And then ultimately, because the big businesses want to focus on big clients and don't want to deal with smaller clients, it actually led to less lending for smaller companies. So it ended up really favoring the people that it was meant to punish, and punishing the people who had absolutely nothing to do with it. And we see that over and over again. So to the extent that we can get government out of the way, I think that that is what goes back and regulates the scales. And I talk to small businesses as a small business advocate all over the country in all different industries. And what they always want is just for the government to leave them alone. Nobody's asking for special treatment unless it's because the government has created some artificial barrier that says, hey, we need to get out of that. But they don't really want anything. They just want the government to remove the barriers that they've put in place that make it impossible or more difficult for them to be in business and can compete with the bigger players. And I think that seems, again, should be very easy and common sense. There's really nothing in life that has been improved by overcomplicating it. Simplicity rules the day and is usually the most elegant solution. And so, it should be very straightforward. But obviously, the political powers that be do everything in their power to keep their power, and to make sure that that isn't something that can happen. Because if they aren't making the favors and doing the things and doling it out, then we don't need them. And then all of a sudden, there's no purpose for them to, exist or to make money or whatever it is. So.
Yeah, I have so many responses to that. That really speaks to me for two reasons. One is that this idea of just leave us alone. We're not asking for more. We don't want anything from you. We just want to be left alone. That's actually been a persistent theme throughout, the civil rights movement, including, going back to Frederick Douglass, who said, what are we asking for? Nothing. We know what happens when you get involved. We know when you start trying to help us out. Leave us alone. And he was such a great advocate of property rights and the right to earn a living, and the things that we sort of, not that we, but that culture sometimes nowadays thinks is divorced or opposed to civil rights. No, actually, people like Frederick Douglass understood that these ideas, property rights, were core to the civil rights movement. But the second thing that spoke to me was this idea of, sticking to principle and recognizing that these things can be, if you betray your principles, they can be weaponized against you in the future. In constitutional law, I think of Chevron deference, which
Yeah.
formally used to require judges to rotely defer to the interpretations of law given by administrative agencies. Even if judges thought that there was an objectively better interpretation out there, they were forced to accept the bureaucrats'
Yeah.
interpretation of law. And that's when individuals were fighting with bureaucrats about things that threaten their whole livelihood, could destroy them. And these judges could not step in. They had to just defer, at least in cases where laws were ambiguous. And at the time, it was thought, well, actually, this is good because we have a sort of conservative administrative state. And so, hey, maybe this is a way to fight back against what was perceived as activists, lefty judges or whatever. And then, of course, that switches, and we've seen the growth of the administrative state and the destruction of liberties. And it was like, oh, this is a bad thing. And then now that the Supreme Court jettisoned Chevron deference and said, no, judges are the ones who judge, at the time, that was under the Biden administration, you saw a lot of critics saying, oh, no, this is going to kneecap the government. This is terrible.
Right.
And then as soon as Trump is in office, you see people say, oh, no, we need to weaponize Chevron. We love, or overturning Chevron.
Right.
In a case called Loper Bright. No, now this is great. We need to fight back against the Trump administration. And it's like, guys, all of this stuff, Chevron was bad because it was
bad. Right.
Not because it affected one group or the other. And so that's something that, in
I warn about this all the time, oh, well, it'd be great. We should give Trump a third term. Okay, well, do you want Obama to have a third term? Well, definitely not. Okay, well, let's just everyone play by the same rules. And I know it's hard because not everybody feels like there has been fairness in the rules, but at some point we just need to say, okay, we're going to move forward and this is the playing field and we're going to make it fair, and whatever happened in the past, it's in the past. Otherwise, we're never going to be able to take that leap forward.
Right. In addition to this lovely book, you have another book that I plowed through, The War on Small Business, and you talk about how lockdowns disproportionately crushed entrepreneurs and how terrible, the whole pandemic and the assumption of power by the government was for the economy and for entrepreneurs out there. And I wonder if you think, has the public fully grasped what happened? I don't feel like we've had a reckoning. Will we ever have a reckoning? Have we had a reckoning?
No. And the crazy thing is that we're living through COVID 2.0 right now, and everybody switched teams, and I want to put my head through a wall. So, during the first time around, even though the Trump administration made the mistake of coming up with 15 days to slow the spread. It was a mistake. It really wasn't them that created all of the economic strife. It was the blue states who, did the lockdowns and had the economic suppression. It was also a blue Congress that put forth the CARES Act, which, Trump probably shouldn't have signed, although they would have had his head if he didn't at the time, but that also allowed for that extension and so on and so forth. And that was really picking winners and losers. It was not based on data and science. It was based on political clout and connections. But the key point there was that we need to do these things for the common good. A couple of people have decided, central planners have decided that this is what the common good is based on their definition of common good for whatever it is that they want to affect, and that they were going to just ignore property rights and get in the way of businesses' ability to freely act, and individuals' ability to freely act, because that's what they wanted to affect. And we all know the outcome of that. It was absolutely devastating. We lost, 7 figures worth of small businesses. We had these long tail effects from supply chain disruptions to labor. We had a lot of mental health issues that I think a lot of people are still grappling with. Then the Biden administration came in, they doubled down on policies, even though everybody was opening again. We had massive inflation. So, you had this very clear scenario, which, was surprising that people fell for the first time. But now we're in a situation with tariffs that I feel the exact same thing is happening. You have a group of people who are saying, for the common good, we are going to de facto put these small businesses out of business because we are going to charge 145% of cost of goods sold on tariffs, which means that for many companies that they're not going to be able to sell any product. They're going to have $0. They're not going to be able to pay their staff because that's what somebody else's vision of the common good looks like. There is no freedom. There is no choice, whether it be for the businesses to have the supply chains they want, whether it's for individuals to purchase how they want. It's no, you have to listen to our dictation with no sort of parallel sort of awareness that, okay, well, now we're doing the same thing. We're disrupting supply chains and we're going to impact labor. And we're literally going to have the same story that we had before with a little bit of a different twist because it's a sequel, but it's the same thing. And now you have the people who were just completely against the infringement of our freedoms the first time around, now being the people who say, no, we have to do this, and vice versa. And again, I just sitting there, it's very frustrating to me as somebody who was consistent on it both times. There are some areas that I agree with, and there are some things that I think are additional beneficial tactics, and I'm rooting for everybody to win. I'm rooting for America and the president, but the lack of awareness of the fact that we're doing the same things under a different name, under a different common good, is very frustrating. And by the way, you have people who are Trump spokespeople who pretend that they know about economics who don't, who are literally out there talking about things like reorganizing the economy, Marxist concept and common good, and getting praise as, oh, you're such a great spokesperson for this, right-leaning administration. So, it's tough, and it's particularly tough after five very grueling years for individual freedoms, for small businesses, for all of the things that we sort of value at the core of America, and to see this happening in a different way is it's pretty upsetting.
Yeah, I think, one echo sort of that we're seeing, or a repeat, in addition to this bringing up again the common good, which that should just send shivers down in people's spines. There's no such thing as the common good. How do you know what the common good is? By the free choices of individuals, right? That's in the common good. But another echo we're seeing, and I should say PLF actually has a lawsuit challenging the tariffs. And at least from a legal perspective, the echo that we're seeing is the invocation of an emergency, because the whole power to impose these tariffs is based on the supposed extraordinary circumstances associated with the opioid crisis and China's failure to sort of regulate or mitigate that, and national security, right? And it's just, again, you would think that people would get tired of this constant invocation of emergencies. The trade deficit is an emergency that requires action now, even though the trade deficit has existed for many, many years. And how do we get away from that? How do we, I've become numb to the people using hyperbole and stating that there's an emergency. And
well, there is an emergency, but it's just the wrong one. The emergency is our debt problem, and nobody seems to care about that. And this certainly doesn't help it in any way, shape, or form, at least in the context of an emergency. So there is an actual emergency that nobody's very focused on, but everything else that's a quote unquote emergency, there's such mixed messaging even about it. Obviously fentanyl and opioids is terrible, and it is something that we should be highly focused on. But we've been told that 20% of the tariffs is because of that, and the rest is because of something else. So even if you're saying that that's the emergency, most of what's happening isn't even attributed to that particular emergency. And it just goes back to the frustration. I think it's a frustration with Congress not doing its job. And so the executive branch has either felt like they were forced or took the opportunity, depending on your kind of slant on that, to pick up these powers to actually be able to take action. And it's really led to bad consequences. But it goes back to the principles. If you don't want Biden or Obama to be making these executive orders, we need to have that same consistency and shut that down and say that it's a bad thing. And there needs to be more force on our representatives to do what it is that they're supposed to do, because clearly, for a long time now, they're not representatives who are serving the interests of the people. And when they say no taxation without representation in the Tea Party, I kind of feel like we're back there again, because we have these quote unquote representatives, but they're really not our representatives. And there are a lot of people who I don't have the ability to vote for who are making decisions that are impacting me. And so there's not a direct representation there either. So I think that the whole thing is pretty messed up, but I appreciate you drawing the line to that rhyme or echo that, again, we're in another emergency, and so that is the cover for being able to take freedoms. And look, I'm not saying we have national security issues. I mean, we need to be building ships here. We need to be, securing our supply chains. We need to be making sure that we have the technology manufacturing here. There are other ways to go about doing that. And if those are the emergency or focus situations, then that's the focus that should happen. It shouldn't be broadly against, everything. I keep calling it throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And, whether or not that's a negotiation tactic, as an individual or a small business, I don't want to be a negotiation tactic.
Yeah, I do want to turn to what you identified as the true emergency here. But first, with COVID, one more thing you were talking about, and it's not just in the book on COVID, it's also in your You Will Own Nothing book. There's this persistent theme of favoritism, that when you enable government, therefore people have an incentive to lobby for what's in their power, who's going to win out, the people with the most political power. And the history of government has been the history of effectively favoritism, protecting incumbents, protecting groups of all sorts, not just big economic players. It depends on whoever's the political favorite of the time. And I wonder, with COVID, because we had lawsuits during COVID too. We represented an art gallery in Napa because, of course, it was just so arbitrary. This art gallery, it's a massive space and they only let in a few people at a time. Everybody, abided by the safety protocol at the time of distancing and masks and what have you. And yet
that was made up.
Yes, but they were like, okay, we're willing to do it, but let us open. We'll do anything. Just like, let us try to earn a living, but they were shut off. They had to shut down completely versus, what the hardware store, the toy store across the street, is complete arbitrariness. And we also had eviction moratorium cases, which is favoritism too, right? Like, well, the property owners must suffer for the benefit of the renters, because everyone thinks property owners must be some amorphous big group rather than human beings. My grandparents, that's how they live. They live on modest income from rental properties that they bought in a inexpensive area when they were young, and now that's what they live off of, and then they couldn't get any rent. So and as I was saying, that's a form of favoritism. And I wonder, how much of COVID do you think was favoritism versus just incompetency?
This is a question I have been asked probably a million times at this point in time. I think there was a mix of both, but in a sense, it almost doesn't matter because we know what drove the outcome. There's no doubt that a lot of these policies were driven, again, not by data, science, or incompetence, but by political clout and connection. So I do tend to believe that there was a nefarious purpose to focus on that. I mean, there are just a lot of data points that point to that. And I do think that there was probably some incompetence, but incompetence can get pointed out and rectified. And given the amount of time that things went on for, when it was super clear what the reality was, I'd have to say, if I was a betting woman, I'd put my chips mostly on bad purposes.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. And it is a theme throughout history. It's the history of government. Yeah. As I was saying, turning to what you identified as the true emergency, I read this book, You Will Own Nothing, and And to put it in much less articulate terms than you, and very briefly, this idea that we're sort of on the brink of a new world order because America has overspent. It's devalued the dollar. It's no longer the world leader, at least it won't be soon. And the elites see this coming. And so both the government and the elites want to solidify their power. And the way that they're going to do this is through taking away people's ability to own anything, because ownership is the cornerstone of not only freedom, but wealth creation. It's scary when you talk about this, what I would agree is a true emergency, this debt problem, and what the potential consequences can be. I mean, you put it in pretty stark terms, talking about our quality of life will go down if there's a new reordering in very meaningful ways, and national security will then actually truly be imperiled. Yeah. And I wondered, how scared should we be? And what level of optimism do you have, if any?
So I think it's a very realistic issue that the debt problem is a hair on fire problem. The Trump administration has creative tools to buy themselves some time, but everything requires Congress's buy-in. It requires it now, and it requires to rein them in on an ongoing basis, because it doesn't help us if we buy ourselves some time, try to right the ship, and then the ship's been righted, and then Congress goes, okay, well, seems pretty good now. We're just going to move it back to where it was before. And so I have absolutely zero confidence that there is going to be any sort of congressional reckoning or reining in that is going to, stop this and kind of put us on the best path to prosperity. I do think that there is a likelihood, and I think that it ties into some of the things that are being done now, although again, I would have picked different tactics, that there is this idea where there could be a reordering that is negotiated, and maybe this is kind of step one of getting people to the table for a broader discussion. There's been a lot of speculation that one way this could happen, and not guaranteeing this is the way it could happen, but it's just one possibility, is that there is a write-up of a neutral reserve asset like gold that is held widely throughout central banks that basically effectively devalues the debt, also devalues our dollar, and so on and so forth. And I think that, in doing those kinds of things, it could put us in a better position. Again, there will be winners and losers, as there always are. And I think that, people will be left behind, but we're already in a impossible situation. So something is going to be done. And no matter what is done, it is going to all lead to sort of devaluing your dollars and your purchasing power and those kinds of things. So there are ways to hopefully hedge for that. I've been recommending people purchase gold since, it was at about half of what it is now a few years ago. So, hopefully those people are happy. So, there is a path forward, and, maybe that does change things. But at the end of the day, if we don't rein in Congress and we don't bring down the size of the government, again, that's going to be temporary, and we're just going to continue on in this kind of crazy cycle. So I do have some optimism that things can be handled, that we're not necessarily going to go into a full default or debt spiral, but we're pretty close. And I don't think that enough people are treating this with the seriousness that they should, and understanding that what's been happening, that a lot of the issues, that the concerns about the middle and working class, are very valid and are completely attributed to the wrong places. They're not attributing it to government spending and to monetary policy, the things that have been driving this wedge, that have been basically creating inflation in both assets and cost of living, and making the people who are asset holders very wealthy at the expense of everyone else who's finding it very difficult to just have a normal cost of living and to accumulate assets. And so I think, that's where focus should be, is how do we remove those barriers, and how do we stop having this favoritism, for this, group of asset holders that has been given a benefit, an unearned benefit, a non-merit based benefit by the government and, government affiliated entities.
Yeah. One optimistic part of your book also is just arming people with solutions, how to fight back. That's, the other part of
Yeah.
it, right? What can we do? And it struck me that, a lot of the tactics that you suggest are, sort of legal related, like policies that we can implement, but also just practical things. You need to own more,
Yeah.
and things like that. But part of the solutions also are just simply cultural. I think reminding people about the importance of business, getting rid of this. I love this phrase. The myth of non-essential businesses. Not only was there a myth of not particular non-essential businesses during COVID, but I think there's a myth in society, in a large portion of society, that business is dirty and not good, and work is inherently exploitive or unimportant, and that translates to the legal world. Within law, the right to earn a living is relegated to a lower level of importance than other constitutional rights, and that's really destructive.
Yeah,
um,
I want to tie that back to today. I'm so glad you're saying that because that's what we're hearing. Nobody needs this many this. Nobody needs this. What you're doing isn't essential. Who are you to say? Who are you to say that? I thought this was America. So that's I'm hearing the same rhyme today, and people cannot or are unwilling to, I should say, connect those dots.
yeah, absolutely. And that is so timely, right? Literally today. um, One other thing that struck me about your book is how much we've, not again, not we, but society has taken for granted, that the government does just own us, and even our kids. That there was just a brief
Yeah.
section, but it really spoke to me about, like, the government thinks it owns your kids. And I took my kids on vacation recently, and I had a whole Twitter rant about it. We took off time. We went during a non-vacation time of the year because it was better for everyone. It's less crowded. Anyway, we come back and I get a very threatening letter about truancy. And, I want you to come into the principal's office and sign a contract that you won't take your kids out of school. And if not, there might be consequences. And they think they own your kids. And we see that with curriculum, and
Yeah.
schools now trying to hide the curriculum from parents. We've given up so much already with compulsory education. And it's all assumed that it's for the good, that well, maybe. And I complain about this, and people say, well, it's not about you. Yes, you're a good parent, but it's for the other parents. That's why we have these systems in place. And it's like, well, why? No, why is this ever the government's job? Why is this ever anybody's business, other
Well,
than
and
the
if it's
parent?
for the common good, why is it that kids, across the country can't read and can't do math and don't understand that they shouldn't take out, six figures of debt, for an education where they're going to get a $50,000 salary and, have no life skills and everything else. So it's not even like we have this quote unquote common good where we can at least point to some real outcomes. I mean, we've seen a continued deterioration of that. So it goes back to having more ability to have free choice. And I do understand that there are kids that have bad parents and they should have, great options too. But again, that could be done in the free choice context and not, kind of at the behest of the teachers union, which has clearly stated that their objective is not to be, for the children and for children's education. It's for themselves.
Yeah, and maybe to tie a bow on all of this, and going back to something you said at the beginning, it is important that we reclaim our rights and responsibility, and our duties to be engaged and to parent. I was struck by the fact that you said that you maybe came to your political or philosophy, because of the way that you were raised. And it reminded me of something I heard Yaron Brooks say, which was, actually, proponents of the free market have won the economic fight, right? Like, the economic fight, you can't, economics don't lie. And we've won that fight. The problem is we haven't won the cultural fight, and it starts when your kids are young, and you say, you have to share, you have to, not, this is your toy and it's in your benefit to share, because then when you want to
Right.
share with your brother, they're going to share back. Instead we just say, no, you must share. And it's starting as early as that we are sort of indoctrinating our kids towards this. um,
I have a
more,
favorite saying is that socialists are the kids who like group projects in school.
right.
That's exactly what it is, right? It's a bunch of people. One person does all of the work, and a bunch of people free ride off the other person's work. And everyone's like, "Oh, this is great," except for the person who does all the work, going, "Why are you getting the A for this?" So, yes, is this whole idea of collectivism and just free riding off of other people's work and efforts really is ingrained in so many things of the schooling system
It
and
is.
in the society.
Yeah, and that's why I very deliberately think about these things, about, the way that I talk to my children, and, I don't take any of this for granted. I understand that it's important to, I hope they don't rebel against me, and that they grow up to be individualists like me. So, like you have with your parents. Well, I don't want to prevail upon too much of your time. Thank you so much for doing this. I loved your books. Truly, I loved them. I blew through both of them in less than a week. I just think they're so important. And there's so much education. I mean, so much of that rhetoric is important for people to hear. We don't hear very many pro-market proponents anymore. Small businesses, I represent them. My entire career has been devoted to representing entrepreneurs. And, we need all the advocates we can get. But there's also so much good economic education in there. I feel like I'm a better person because of it. So thank you so much for your books, and thank you so much for agreeing to be here today.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, first of all, for your work. It's super important. I've partnered with your organization many times on a documentary of inclusions in my last book and so on and so forth, and love your mission and think it's incredible to have people like yourself who are so smart and such fierce advocates being willing to stand up and help people and entrepreneurs and small businesses, stand up against the government, because it's a really difficult thing to do. So thank you. And I hope everybody supports your work, and really enjoy the conversation.